Kamala Harris and Donald Trump traded jabs today on the U.S. campaign trail.
He who said that he would, quote, terminate the Constitution of the United States. He who said he would be a dictator on day one. He who intends to weaponize the Department of Justice against his political enemies.
Kamala has imported an army of illegal alien gang members and migrant criminals from the dungeons of the third world. We are being led by stupid people. We cannot take it anymore.
With less than a month to go until the election, the race is still very tight, and every last vote increasingly will matter. Numbers from Monmouth University's Polling Institute shows Harris leading with 49% support from registered voters, while Trump is close behind at 44%. Patrick Murray is the director of Monmouth University's Polling Institute, and he joins me now. Patrick Murray, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
It's good to be with you, David.
Let's start with the big picture assessment of where the race is. Your latest polling has Harris at 49% and Trump at 44%. But because of the way the Electoral College works, that's kind of neck and neck, right? And you've been noting there's been practically no change in the race since Harris joined. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, the big shift was when we switched to Democratic candidates here. And once that happened, it has been really a razor-thin race. So, it's 4 points among all registered voters. But the real question we have is who's going to go out and vote? And when you're looking at polling coming out of our swing states, which shows a lead for either one of the two candidates of anywhere from 1 to 2 points. It means it's a toss-up because a difference of 10,000 voters in Pennsylvania or 15,000 voters in Michigan who do or don't show up is the tail of the tape. And so the polling is telling us you should be prepared for any outcome on Election Day.
Do you expect it to stay that tight between now and November 5th? Do you think, or do you see it maybe deviating from this sort of deadlock?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, polls are a snapshot in time, so we can only tell what we're doing. But these snapshots have been pretty consistent. And we've had some big events. We've had assassination attempts. We've had a huge debate, which under normal circumstances would swing towards the winner, at least temporarily, by 4 or 5 points. We just didn't see any of that coming out of this. So I doubt very much that we're going to see something coming up over the next few weeks that's going to shift this underlying dynamic any more than it is right now.
I laughed a bit there when you said we had some big events because, boy, is that ever the understatement of this election, right? Yeah. Like consequential debates, multiple, it is, if you scripted it, they would reject it because it's been that unpredictable. So when it's this unpredictable and still that tight, what are the key things that you watch for when you have an election this close going into this stretch run?
Well, we look for key voter groups and what's motivating them. I mean, this is why we said what people aren't moving because they're not up in the air about who's got a better position on this issue or that issue. It's what issues are more important to me and align with my values and my identity of where I fit in the political world here in America. And that is determining, is it important enough to go out to vote? So when each of these campaigns are sending people out to knock on doors, make phone calls, they know that they're going to knock on doors and make calls to people who are aligned with them. The real question is, do they feel it's worth their time and effort to go out and vote? Well, things change because of that. And that's really the focus. So we're seeing a couple of things right now that suggest that Kamala Harris is doing really well in areas where it's competitive, but not as well in areas where Democrats do really, really strongly. I mean, she's going to win those areas, but not by as much as prior Democrats have won those areas. And that could matter, maybe not for the Electoral College in a place like California, which is heavily Democratic to begin with, so it doesn't matter what the margin is. But again, when we talk like our swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, they have significant urban areas where she needs to get a set number. She knows how many votes she needs to get out of Detroit and Philadelphia in order to win those states, and no matter how competitive she is in the rest of the state.
Right. I mean, there's talk of North Carolina maybe being in play, and then you look at some of the Sun Belt states. But really, for this election, it's Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That's the ball game, right? If the Democrats don't win all three of those, is that a fair assessment, in your view?
Yeah, well, I think so, because I think it's hard to imagine a situation where you would lose those states, but yet win
Right.
North Carolina and Arizona and everything else. So those states, they are the tipping point states.
So it all comes down to motivation, and it all comes down to like getting your core groups motivated and to come out and vote for you. We saw Kamala Harris appeal to young women by going on the Call Her Daddy podcast. Barack Obama has been out appealing to black men specifically in Pennsylvania to vote for Harris. What does that tell you of what they're seeing in these constituencies, in particular in those swing states, because that's where it really matters?
Right. They're seeing the same thing that we're seeing in the public polling, which is that weakness in urban areas for Kamala Harris is among men. It's among black men. It's among Latino men. She's winning those groups, but not by as much as a Democrat typically would. So you're trying to get those folks back on board. At the same time, you have strength, for example, in suburban area among college-educated women who are worried about things like abortion rights and other reproductive freedoms and freedoms in general. And what you're trying to do there is, you're going to win those groups really big. Can I get more of those people out to vote? So that's what this messaging is all about. Right. Is really getting that group that is leaning towards you to cast that ballot.
Right, so not just win, but run up the score so much that it offsets deficiencies in other areas, because the gender gap, the male vote in particular, skews towards Donald Trump, and that's what elected Biden. He won back a lot of those non-college educated white men in particular, right, in 2020.
Right, and he didn't win that group, but he did decently enough in that group that offset that, and that was the key. And that's why you see, one of the things our polling is telling us is that white men are really concerned about immigration. They feel that that's threatening their way of life, and so it makes perfect sense while Donald Trump is focusing on that issue almost exclusively and ginning up that base, because you want to get more of that voter out to vote, because if they do come out to vote, you know that they're voting for you if you're Donald Trump.
Okay, I want to touch on two last points before we let you go. The first being the get out the vote effort. There's motivation, but I wonder about how polls are one thing, it's turning them into votes, that's another. And all the reports you see out of the U.S. is Kamala Harris has raised $1 billion and Donald Trump doesn't have field offices in different parts of the United States. From a mechanical on-the-ground vote delivery perspective, that suggests Kamala Harris should be able to build a bigger machine, though the MAGA movement maybe doesn't need people to get them to the polls. How does that factor into what you think might happen?
Yeah, and we've seen that in the past. I mean, we've seen in some of our off-cycle elections where these MAGA voters came out, and there wasn't anything going on in that particular election that drove them out, but we saw them come out because they've been activated, just that they need to vote. Their way of life is under threat, and therefore they have to vote in every election. And I think that what Donald Trump can count on that means that the Harris machine needs to be significantly better at getting out the vote. Now, we know she has a lot of money. The question that we have that isn't completely answered yet is, does she have the correct infrastructure? Because you need to contact voters, 6-7 times before they say, if somebody who's sitting on the fence saying, yeah, okay, I'll go out to vote. Do you have that infrastructure in place? Because you got the money to do it. You just need the volunteers and the infrastructure in order to implement that.
Right, and they've had success in off-cycle elections too, the Democrats, when reproductive rights and issues like that are on the ballot, and we've seen a lot of young women registering to vote, so who knows where that fits into this. But I just want to end on the undecided voter. With the polarization and the clear, stark choice that exists in the United States, is there really enough undecided voters out there right now to have a material difference on what we see on November 5th?
There's two ways to answer that question, which is, are there enough in the polls that we can pinpoint?
Right.
And there aren't. They just don't exist. But polls measure in kind of feet and yards, as we say. But this election is going to be settled in inches. And that means if there are 10,000 undecided voters in Pennsylvania who swing one way, that could be the ball game. We're not picking that up in polling because it's just too small. We're focusing much more on the turnout question because we can see that in our polling. But those undecided voters, they're a very small group. They're an infinitesimally small group. But again, if this election is as close as we think it's going to be in these key states, they could be the whole ball game right there.
Is it true in the U.S., often I've seen in provincial and national elections here, that at this late in the campaign, undecided voters either statistically break down along the lines of the decided voters or they just don't vote? Is that what you see there?
Yeah, we're seeing more that they're not going to vote. In fact, when we apply some of the key motivational factors there, almost everyone that we see as calling themselves at least an undecided voter disappears from the electorate. That's, if you're undecided at this point, it simply means that you're just not invested enough in this election to think that it matters. So you're not going to vote.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have 3 provincial elections in this country before we get to the U.S. election, but I think that's the one everyone's watching more closely. Patrick Murray, Director of Monmouth University's Polling Institute. Great to have you here. Thanks for being here, sir.
My pleasure, David.